welcome to the Unreal BootCamp lesson on an overview of user entities. In this lesson, we're going to go over the logic needed to fully grasp user entities. User entities are similar to global entities with a few key differences. The first difference is that by default, the entity data is owned by the user. That means by default, the user entity can only be accessed by the user with ownership of the entity and not other players. The second difference is that you can write data to the entity. Remember, global entities are basically read-only objects. This is an important feature since you can write all kinds of user data to brainCloud. In the next few lessons, we'll be using user entities to store the user's progress in the example game's Horde mode. The user entities module is easily the most complex module so far in the brainCloud Bootcamp series. Part of the complexity arises from the third key difference from global entities. Unlike global entities, which can be created on the brainCloud portal, user entities are instead created programmatically on the client. To help mitigate this complexity, we'll be demonstrating a high-level use case in just a moment. But first, we need to go over a trio of brainCloud requests that we'll need to use. The first request is called create entity. This request creates a new entity on the server. When making the request, we need to supply the following parameters: the entity type, the entity's initial data object, and the entity's ACL. Remember that the ACL is just access permissions for the entity. By making this request, brainCloud will then generate a unique entity ID and create the entity on the server. The unique entity ID is then returned as part of the response. The second request is called getEnitiesByType. This request takes in one parameter, the entity type, and it will return all the entities associated with the user that match the supplied entity type. In the event that the user does not have any entities that match the entity type parameter, then an empty array will be returned in the response instead. The last request is called updateEntity. This request is used to update an already existing entity on the brainCloud server. This request takes in the following parameters: the entity ID, the entity type, the entity data object to update. It's important to note that the entity data object supplied in this request will replace the existing entity data object on the brainCloud server. This request also takes in the entity ACL and the version as parameters. For the version parameter, you can enter -1 to indicate that it's the newest version of the entity. Now that we are familiar with these three brainCloud requests, let's proceed with the user entity high-level use case example. First, the user opens the app and authenticates with brainCloud. On a successful authentication response, the getEnitiesByType request is invoked, passing in the entity type to return. If the response contains an empty array of entities, that means that the user entity for the supplied entity type has not been created yet for this user. As a result, the create entity request is made, passing in the entity type, the JSON data object, and the ACL as parameters. The user entity is created on the server and a response is returned. The user plays the game and completes the first level. The update entity request is then made to update brainCloud with the changes to the user entity's data. After beating level 1, the user decides they are done playing and they end their session. Later, the user decides to play the game again. The app authenticates with brainCloud. On a successful authentication response, the getEnitiesByType request is then made. This time, the response will contain an array with the user entity data. That's because the user entity was created during the previous session. The user plays the game and this time completes level 2. The update entity request is made to update brainCloud with the changes to the user entity's data. And that's basically it. I hope that this high-level example has demonstrated how to effectively utilize user entities. In the next 2 lessons, we're going to be going over how to create user entities programmatically and how to update them in the example game. Creating user entities is the next lesson in the Unreal Bootcamp.